This is the CyberWriter. It's a unique design, about 9 inches high, almost 12 inches deep, and about 12 and a half inches wide. It's got a 10.1 inch screen, a 60% mechanical keyboard. It's a pretty good keyboard. It's not the best. It could be better, but it does a good job. You'd have to make it wider if you wanted to put a better keyboard in. That increases quite a bit of things. So I just went with this keyboard, and this is a pretty cheap keyboard as well. I first saw the microjournal about a month and a half ago on a Raspberry Pi news post where they were featuring it primarily because it was a Raspberry Pi Zero based device. Perfect, it was really nice looking. Really wanted to pick something like that up, or even better, maybe try making one. This is my example of a dedicated writing device. Which I didn't really know existed before about a month and a half ago. My idea of a dedicated writing device was a typewriter, which I have. I have a nice Smith Corona from 1935, and that is a very nice typewriter. As most people who are into things, you want to have a lot of different ways to write or to do any job, and tools are fun. So I thought making this would be kind of a fun challenge. One of the key points of this whole idea was really developing some kind of software that you could boot right into and use without thinking at all. What I didn't want or wasn't concerned with was any kind of real editing features in this. So this one is a pretty simple writing program. It's not really a word processor. The only things it really does is count words, counts characters. It has a help, which you have to limit how many things you could put in this file, so you want to limit how many things the software can do, because otherwise it gets too complicated with all the keyboard movements. So I wanted to make sure everything was just controlled by the keyboard, and you didn't need a whole lot of special equipment or special anything to run it. Like, you don't really need the Baltic birch part. The case is not really part of this whole situation. It's just a way to house this at a specific angle and the keyboard at a specific height. I do like this keyboard at this height. It makes this keyboard much better than it otherwise is when you buy it. I think any kind of product like this, like a cheap keyboard, it gets improved dramatically if you put it in something that's very substantial. The wrist rest matters a lot to help the keyboard feel more substantial and useful. Otherwise, it's a rather chintzy keyboard. I also wanted a blue color, mostly because I like the blue, it really pops. You needed an HDMI screen to do that color, so that was perfect, and a 10.1 inch is a common size, so that makes it more affordable. I really like the blue though, because it reminds me of Doogie Howser at the end of his videos. He would do his journal in that blue C64 kind of look. While you can do other colors on here, you know, that is mostly the best is the blue. It was really designed to use blue. I mean, it's nice to have options though. So again, having these kind of options makes it sort of more customizable. But again, the blue is the default color. So everything boots up in that kind of color. I also have these kind of windows to get into the files. So when you make a file, you have to get the file, save the file, get the file, delete the file. You can't move files or anything like that in here, but you can view them and go into them. And then you can move around and view them, save them, that kind of thing. It's easy to create new files. Just Control-N is a new file. And easy to save a file and easy to move between files. So basically these are like windows that pop up. So you have a window at the top and you have a window here and you have like a new window that pops underneath for the help and for the theme. So otherwise it's pretty simple. It doesn't do a whole lot. You can increase the size of the text and then you can decrease the size of the text. You can't change the font. I mean, you could make anything you want happen, but it's going to make everything a lot more complicated. And it's really unnecessary to make it so complicated. Right now I have it defaulting to just Control-M and it sends an email. So whatever's on the screen gets sent to the email. So that makes it nice and simple. So there's no dealing with files or anything like that. You could, of course, because this is a Raspberry Pi computer, you can SSH in and WinSCP copies in and out, or you could make a USB connection and grab the files however you want. That's kind of up to you. But the idea is that I wanted the software to be useful and simple, but basically do those key things. Size of the text needs to increase or decrease. The color needs to be blue or some other kind of bright color like that. This is not meant to be where on the e-ink screens they're really good on your eyes or any of that kind of stuff. I wasn't thinking of using that kind of thing, and those screens are much smaller. And this is more like a kind of like a writing appliance, something you can move and kind of take with you. It's relatively light. I mean, it's substantial. It's got a lot of MDF inside. It's 1/2-inch Baltic birch on the outside here, and otherwise 1/4-inch Baltic birch on these other parts. But it's not super heavy. But it feels dead, so it doesn't kind of move at all, so it's kind of nice. It's got the rubberized feet, so it doesn't move. I like the elevation of it. It feels like a good height. And the wrist rest is super important. But the only way you can get the files out is to email them and otherwise type them in, anything you want. But it's easy to make a new file. You can just make a new file, make a new file. So it's nice and easy. And then you can just go back to, you know, your file you want. So it's easy to move between the files. It's pretty much easy to do anything. Again, if it does too much, it's not going to do it quickly. Those limitations seem reasonable. Otherwise, I was concerned about getting this together on a nice fixed, good kind of writing angle and a distance to the keyboard. I mean, that's all it pretty much is. CyberWriter just comes from that. I was told it looks like the angles of a Cybertruck. So that's why we call it a CyberWriter, because it looks like those angles. That's it. The term cyberdeck, this is not really related to that, even though the same word is used. It just kind of reminds somebody of those angles of the truck. It doesn't use much power either, This just pretty much can boot off a 1 amp 5 volt power supply. So you don't need any kind of high current power supply or anything. You can just use any kind of low power USB, which is good because then you can power it from anything anywhere. It's got a Type-C input, but other than that, everything is low power. Really, the device is not very large. And when you compare it to a normal screen, like a desktop screen, those are quite much larger than this. This is pretty small. It's a nice focused writing device in that sense. I really can't think of too many improvements to make to this as of this recording. It does exactly what I wanted it to do, which is very little. You type, you send it by email. That's about it. Other than that, it's got to be comfortable to type on, comfortable to use, and easy to move around, and it is. This was not the first design. This is more like the final design. Initially, I used these pieces to capture the screen. Because the screen doesn't have any screw points, you have to build something to connect to the screen in the back. There's the HDMI controller in the back that I designed this to fit around to eventually be glued to it, so that the weight would be supported by the glue and by the HDMI controller, which is screwed on. And then that would be sandwiched on. The screw points here match with these screw points here, and you'd effectively sandwich this together. And initially that seemed like a good idea, and you can see how it's rounded here. These were also points that were designed to have hinges eventually for a more of like a laptop situation, which ended up being not the best idea. So then I built a holder for this whole group, so that this effectively would be some type of sort of like at least getting the angle concept. That was originally for the idea of how the hinges would work. And then I liked the concept of the fixed angle based on that. I don't remember the angle, but it's very similar to the final angle. But what I did understand initially was that this was a bad idea, this keyboard. This is the initial keyboard. It comes in this case. It's screwed on underneath the caps. And this basically was designed for this. And basically the first thing you notice is that there's no support here. So you're up here and there's no support for those keys. So that led to basically an extension on the bottom. This was too tight, too narrow. And then it began to occur to me that making a laptop with this type of keyboard has the problem of that the base needs to be the same height, basically, as the foldable top, the screen. So that there's not a lot of room, in this case, for this type of keyboard and a wrist rest. So I basically took this design concept and extended it to this design, which is cardboard. But it is basically the final design with a few tweaks. And this was the space here for the keyboard. And this is much more support to be up on this wrists, which makes the keyboard work a lot better. Initially, it seemed like the screen was relatively small compared to the keyboard. But when you consider the bezel around, it kind of fits properly. And you have to go with what's worthwhile trying to figure out how to make here. So, and of course you're fitting things with wood. The initial design had the problem of being with these screws, which were all visible, sandwiching the screen together with those screws. So that kind of looked awkward. So that's why I get rid of the screws. But then the problem is, how do you secure things to be smooth so that you have a smooth kind of look, like an uninterrupted kind of line, and especially around the screen, because this is where you would put screws. And so they are, but they're on the other side. You just don't see them. The idea, though, is that it's also difficult to get this to all line up. Around here, you could have made notches to notch this into this other wood, which is typically what I do when I laser cut projects. The problem with that is that that would be quite visible, and even if you sanded the laser very well, the laser cut edges, it's still pretty difficult to get that perfect, and even then, it's very busy looking. It's not as smooth. So the problem of the fasteners was, how do you deal with connecting this whole thing, making it smooth and making it have no screws? And so the only other option really was glue. And then lining these materials up to the edges to glue properly is quite difficult. You can imagine gluing edge to edge is quite weak. So you don't want to do that. So then the internal structure made of MDF worked really well, because then there's a lot of surface to glue to, and then it would be easier to line things up. Part of the reason for that was also that if you ever made another one, or if you made a bunch of them, or whatever you did, they have to be repeatable. There's got to be some way to consistently get this to stay together. If it's very difficult to do each time, then they're going to look different, or you're not going to want to make it. I have another idea coming up where I'm going to basically use this same case and actually put a Raspberry Pi 5 in it with some other features and speakers and things like that. So it has to be a modular design, but fundamentally it has to come together the same way. Otherwise it's going to be too difficult to line up the spaces. You want this to be very smooth so that there's no gaps anywhere, because otherwise there's no way to align it. And so the internal structure helps to align it. There are still some more changes to do on this. One of the things I wanted to work on was getting the screen to be able to dim somehow. I haven't really looked into that further, but other than some kind of opaque mask you could put on it, or through software, I haven't thought about it too much. It hasn't been a problem with this brightness, but right now there's no brightness control. In terms of the software, there's very little I would change on that. It's working very well, other than making it a little easier to edit unless you're going into the main Raspberry Pi software, because it is a computer, so you can be right in here, anyway. So, but other than that, you're fine with editing minimally. In terms of shutdown, I was initially going to use like a momentary switch and with a relay inside. By using a momentary switch and a relay, I could initiate a shutdown and then have the relay close off power to the Pi. And then you would initiate the momentary switch again, it would open the relay and let power to the Pi and then stay open. It seemed easier just to do this. So right now the shutdown is just a command and then you hit shut down. And then you just turn the switch off to know that there's no power going to it, so that when you turn it back on, it sends power to the Pi and starts it back up. I don't think I would change that. It seems to be working very well. In terms of the batteries, the same thing kind of applies. It's easier to just go with it the way it is, because this is such a universal power, a Type-C connector that can run with any type of power level, 1 amp or something around there. It basically uses 5 watts. so that is convenient enough that a battery doesn't really help out the situation. The whole thing is easy to move around, and then you can plug it in anywhere from any level power supply. So let's try that on a lower power supply. This doesn't use a lot of power, so you can use a simple stick here. Let's try this one. I don't think this would power it very long, but it would work. So that was no problem there. So in that sense, it is quite portable. So let's take a look at the back. I'm using M3 screws here, and these are about 1 inch. This is still on. Okay, and you just pop it out, and then put these little handles here, because otherwise it's a little hard to get out. There's nowhere to grip it. So these kind of handles kind of go with it. Continues the design. So basically there's not a lot in here. There's the Pi, the HDMI controller on the screen, and the power wires basically are, there's a red LED light, and there's a switch, and I used a splitter, so where it takes a Type-C connection, and it splits it over to the microcontroller on the Raspberry Pi, and then I have it porting to a 90-degree micro to USB Type-C from the screen. And then I'm also using a ribbon here, which was unnecessary. The reason I went with the ribbon was because initially I wanted a flatter design for a laptop. That wasn't necessary here, but I just continued to use it. And that goes from HDMI to a HDMI micro. And that's about it. Otherwise you have the keyboard in here. We probably should shut this down. That battery wasn't too full. There's quite a lot of space in this box, and that's why for a new design that was dealing with a Raspberry Pi 5, there's enough room in here to mount the 5 with a few other things. So I think that would be a nice kind of space for some more interesting components. Although I like this design because it is very usable. It's very usable for if you're teaching someone how to type as well, because then they can't possibly get distracted with anything else, and then there's only one thing they can do, and that's practice typing. So it's a nice device for that, much like a typewriter. Although if anybody has used a typewriter, they realize how hard you have to push the keys on a typewriter to practice. So this makes a lot more sense if you're actually practicing how to type properly. You can't do anything else. So putting this back on is basically the same way. These were indexed to these positions, so it really can't go anywhere else. And it's a tight fit. I like the idea of having multiple versions of this because it's such a nice case to fit different kind of uses. The 10-inch screen is a really perfect size for many kind of projects. It's on the large side for certain projects, but for this kind of project it's perfect. And for any kind of Raspberry Pi 5 situation, it would be also a good size. And it still remains very portable. I don't have any revisions in mind for a future design at this point. Everything's been very good. So I suppose, this would be stable for now. If you would like to build one of these on your own, I have made a plan that's available in my shop. Basically, it's going to take you through the SVG files to be able to either laser cut them or print them and cut them some other way. Of course, you could easily adapt this basic structure to a 3D printing or whatever else you'd like. You could also do the cardboard. The cardboard version is actually rather stable. It's stronger than you'd realize. And if you were a bit neater, you could certainly use this as the computer housing. So the files could be used to make this as well. And of course this, you just use a straight edge and any kind of cardboard. This was packaging, just regular packaging. And I used hot glue to secure this. And if you spray painted it, it certainly would look pretty good. And it holds this fine. You could just do the same basic kind of structure and put it back on here. And it's a little easier because you don't need to put all that internal structure. This is just pretty much empty in here. It's not quite as strong, but if you reinforced it and if you used the SVG files, you'd be able to certainly reinforce this significantly. Because the plywood would also bend if you didn't have the supports underneath. It just needs support no matter how you do it. But this design would be perfect to use in cardboard, and you could make this quite nice. And weather it, do any kind of other design to it. So you don't really need to use the Baltic birch. So the whole project would be significantly cheaper and easier to do if you used plywood and, the cardboard and made it nice looking. And then everything else would be held in place. All the other components are fine. They're the same components. So you could do that as well. So in the plans, you'll find the Raspberry Pi and all that. And on the GitHub page, you'll find how to use the software and how to install it on a Raspberry Pi Zero. So thanks for watching. And if you have any questions, let me know. And if you have any ideas for the software to improve it, let me know. Thank you.